made from various kinds of biomass and crops, okay, and also methanol, which can also be made from biomass as well as from natural gas and coal. Now, flex fuel cars can be made at essentially negligible additional cost beyond the current cost of production of standard cars that are ecumenical, that can use methanol, ethanol, and gasoline equally, and thus put these fuels into free competition. Now let me explain. The current price of methanol, today's spot market price, unsubsidized for methanol, is $1.35 a gallon. That's what it is. What? $1.13. $1.13, I stand corrected. All right. Okay, I'll be working with data a few days ago. Okay, so it's down to $1.13 a gallon. I took a 2007 Chevy Cobalt. Okay, now this is marketed as a non-flex fuel car, but in fact it has the same computer in it and the same engine as the HHR, which is a flex fuel car. It's being sold, or Cobalt is no longer sold, but it was sold as a non-flex fuel car, despite the fact it had all the equipment in it to make it a flex fuel car. Okay. I corrected the programming of the car, okay, and I replaced the seals. There are seals in the car that would be fine for ethanol and gasoline, but they're not fine for methanol. They're made of Viton. I replaced them with Buna-N seals, which cost 41 cents. And I ran it on methanol. I got 24 miles to the gallon. Doesn't sound that impressive. On gasoline, the car will get 34 miles to the gallon. Except that this fuel costs 30% of what gasoline costs. This is equivalent in miles per dollar to 60 miles per gallon. And this isn't with some future car that will be invented using, you know, the singularity, whatever. No, this is with a used car that I picked up for $4,000 from a local dealer. Okay, and there is absolutely no reason, there was a time actually when it was true that making a car flex fuel would add $100 to its production cost. That is no longer the case. Virtually all cars currently being sold in the United States have computers in them that are capable of flex fuel operation. They have to, because they sell the cars in Brazil where they're all flex fuel. Okay? The only difference is the software. That is, if you want to make them ethanol compatible, if you want to make them methanol compatible, they need to have methanol compatible rubbers as seals instead of Viton, which is not methanol compatible. Next chart. Now, if we did this, it has to be understood, this is a global effect we're taking here. It's a global move against OPEC. Because if you make it the law that to sell a car in the USA, it's got to give the consumer fuel choice, then all the foreign car makers should be forced to switch their lines over as well. And that means that not only Japanese cars sold in America, but Japanese cars sold in Japan and all across Asia would also be flex fuel, and Korean cars and European cars sold globally. And so we would very quickly have a situation where gasoline will be forced to compete at the pump against both ethanol and methanol made from any number of possible sources all over the world. This would put a permanent global constraint on the price of oil, a competitive constraint that does not currently exist and which is vitally necessary. Next chart. Okay, so consequences. Create a huge advanced sector market for third world agricultural produce, because we wouldn't need to block third world biofuels from coming into the US anymore, because the market for ethanol would be much bigger than the American corn growers could grow to. That's great. They can sell all the ethanol they want. This is the market. Okay, trade barriers come down. Tropical agricultural countries get income for development. We get markets to sell farm technology, tractors, etc. Okay, the oil cartels, vertical monopoly on the world fuel supply is broken, oil prices are constrained, terrorist funding is curtailed, threat of superpower confrontation in the Middle East is mitigated, and also you have benefits against global warming and conventional pollution. Next chart. Now, I had an article in National Review which discussed some of this earlier this week. It's still online, okay? Because the question has repeatedly come up, if it's so easy to make these cars methanol capable, why aren't the automakers doing it? I don't know, I'm an engineer, not a psychiatrist, okay? But I do know that it is very easy to make them run flex fuel. But the fact is they haven't, even though in 2008 the big three promised they would have 50% of their line be flex fuel by 2012 by now, and that has not been done. They're only about 10% of their line is flex fuel, okay? There are some issues that would lead us to believe that they won't unless they're forced. And that is because there's conflicts of interest involved here. Now, in the case of the European manufacturers, It's quite direct. Okay, Volkswagen is 17% owned by the sovereign wealth fund of the government of Qatar. Okay, what I was telling you about them buying into companies here. Okay, Daimler, between the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, 16% owned by Arab sovereign wealth funds. Other years, Saab, I can't read it, but it's a large percentage, okay, so forth. In the case of Fiat, 2% owned by Libya, actually, and Fiat owns Chrysler, 52%. Okay. Now, in the case of the American owners, it's not as clear. You do have 1% of GM owned by Prince bin Khalil of Saudi Arabia. There may be larger fractions of these companies owned by Arab sovereign wealth funds that are shielded from public notice by SEC laws through shielding them from full disclosure that were put in place to facilitate petrodollar recycling. But what we do know, okay, is that the main public positions in these companies are held by large Wall Street funds, okay, which have much larger investments in oil than they have in automobiles. Okay, in other words, you know, one of these funds may have a couple of billion invested in GM, and that's a lot of GM, but they've got $50 billion invested in oil. And so the major investment is the oil, and you can call it a conspiracy if you like, you can just call it a conflict of interest. It's clearly a conflict of interest, and in any case, they have not moved in defiance of this conflict of interest. They have not implemented flex fuel, and that is why government action on this account is warranted. Next chart. Now, this is last Saturday's New York Times. Okay, article on page 1 on the left. U.S. agencies see no move by Iran to build an atomic bomb. Straight from the CIA. Okay, article on page 8. Atomic Agency, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, says Iran is making purified nuclear fuel at a protected site. That is to say, 20% enriched uranium-235 at a site protected under 250 feet of ground. Okay, the Iranians say they're doing this as part of scientific research. Okay, now, to make commercial reactors, you only need 3% enriched fuel. 20% enriched fuel is a step on the way to making bomb-grade uranium. Okay, that's all it is. That's all you need it for. Okay, so how come the CIA didn't know about this? Maybe they didn't read the article on page 8. Okay. No, of course they know about it. Okay, but they don't want to say it because the possible effects of taking action against Iran would be so dire, or potentially so dire, in terms of economic blowback, should this result in a disruption of the oil flow from the Middle East, that our policy for dealing with the Iranian nuclear bomb effort is to pretend that we don't know that it is happening. Okay? Now, this is not acceptable for us to be conducting our policy, and terrorists are making atomic bombs, and we have to say, well, we don't know this is really happening. Okay, next chart. Now, during World War II, you know, we brought the Axis to its knees by cutting off their oil supplies. On May 11th, 1944, the Third Reich ruled all of continental Europe, and 1 year later, it didn't exist. Why? Because on May 12th, 1944, the U.S. Army Air Corps hit the German synthetic fuel plants at Leona with 935 B-24s and totally destroyed it in 1 day. And Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, went there the next day and said, that's it, the war's lost. We're out of gas. And it's true. Within 3 months, they couldn't move their tanks, couldn't fly their planes. Last German Panzer offensive ran out of gas right on the battlefield in the Ardennes. Japan, same thing. We cut off their oil supply by sinking their tankers. They couldn't get oil from Indonesia to Japan. They had no fuel. In 1945, Imperial Japan, totally on the ropes, still was able to produce thousands of fighter aircraft. They couldn't get one in the sky to challenge the Enola Gay when she showed up over Hiroshima. They were done. No oil. Why did we take out their oil? Because we didn't need it. The United States alone produced 60% of the world's oil in the 1940s. Today we produce 8, and we're scared of any action whatsoever that might disrupt this oil from the Gulf. So what I'm talking about here is that this is not just about the difference between $3 gas and $4 gas, or this and that, and I can save you 75% on your next tank. No, this is about the fundamental security position of the United States in the world. Next chart. Skip it. Next chart. So, look, when you talk about energy security, people's eyes glaze over because they've heard this since 1973 and nothing has been done, and people have come to the implicit conclusion that nothing can be done, that this is a problem like teenage juvenile delinquency, you know. A politician gets up and says, I am going to make teenagers behave. Good luck. Okay? But if you have a policy, you can do it. Brazil has done it. In 1980, they were 80% dependent on foreign oil. We were 35. Today we are 60, they are 0. Because they implemented a policy, which in large measure has been based on flex fuel. They also expanded their drilling, but if all they had done, they'd still be 40% dependent on foreign oil. So it's a question of taking leadership. That's what this is about.
Thank you, and thank you very much to our speakers.